August 1945. Luzon, the Philippines. The sun hung low over the ruined hills as a group of exhausted Japanese women officers, nurses, clerks, communication specialists, were led toward a makeshift American aid station. Their uniforms were torn from weeks of retreat. Their canteens were empty. Their faces were cracked with sunburn and dehydration. They expected interrogation. They expected humiliation. Some silently braced for death. Instead, the Americans handed them soap. Not a harsh military block, but a smooth, pale bar with a faint scent of lavender. A medic placed a tube of lip balm in one woman's hand. She stared at it as if it were contraband. Another officer blinked at the small hygiene kit offered to her. Cotton pads, ointment, a toothbrush. Her fingers trembled. These were luxuries she hadn't seen in years. For a long moment, no one spoke. The Americans simply stepped back, giving them space to wash, to breathe, to exist as human beings again. And in that strange stillness, surrounded by a war not yet fully ended, the women realized they were experiencing something unthinkable. Kindness from the enemy. A moment so small it seemed impossible. Yet it would change everything that followed. The final months of the Pacific War were defined by collapse. Japan's defensive perimeter had crumbled, island by island. And by early 1945, the imperial military was fighting a slow, desperate retreat across the Philippines. Luzon, once one of Japan's proudest conquests, had become a battlefield of exhaustion, hunger, and constant bombardment. The American return, led by General Douglas MacArthur, unleashed overwhelming firepower onto Japanese units scattered across mountains, jungles, and valleys. Among the soldiers caught in this collapse were hundreds of Japanese women officers. They belonged to auxiliary branches of the Imperial Army and Navy. Nurses trained in battlefield medicine. Communication operators who routed coded messages. Clerks who managed records. And logistics specialists who kept dwindling supplies moving. Many had volunteered believing they were supporting a noble national cause. None had been prepared for the brutality of total defeat. As American forces tightened their grip on Luzon throughout the spring and summer of 1945, Japanese command structures fractured. Male officers were killed, isolated, or operating in fragmented pockets. Food stockpiles collapsed. Medical supplies ran out. In many forward positions, the only thing left to eat was grass, roots, or whatever animals could be found. Diseases like malaria, dysentery, and beriberi spread unchecked. Yet the women officers remained bound to a wartime doctrine drilled into them since training. Capture was intolerable. Surrender was shame. Live capture by Americans was unthinkable. From schoolrooms to military manuals, they had been told that Allied troops would torture, assault, humiliate, and ultimately kill them. Propaganda portrayed Americans as savages who held no humanity toward Japanese prisoners, particularly women. So these women hid. For weeks, they moved through remote ravines and abandoned villages, drinking from streams and sheltering under uprooted trees. Some burned their uniforms to avoid recognition. Others clutched their military papers tightly, fearing court-martial even in defeat. By mid-August, small groups of surviving women officers were scattered across Luzon, dehydrated, starved, and physically broken. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in August 15th, the women weren't listening to radios. They were still clinging to survival in ravines and mountain pockets. Many did not know the war had ended. Others refused to believe it had. Their training told them American mercy did not exist. Their morale told them a warrior's death was more honorable than an uncertain surrender. But the reality on the ground was shifting. American forces had issued orders to search for all remaining Japanese personnel, combatants and non-combatants, treating them as potentially hostile, but also as human beings needing medical aid. For US units on Luzon, the discovery of Japanese women officers was not expected. It was rare, and it presented a completely different challenge from capturing armed male soldiers. The first groups of Japanese women encountered by the Americans were skeletal, sunburned, and near collapse. Many were in their early 20s. Some could no longer walk. Several looked no different from civilian refugees. When US patrols located them, uncertainty filled the air from both sides. The women expected violence. The Americans expected resistance. Instead, what happened was almost mundane, but historically remarkable. American medics began distributing standard humanitarian kits: water, wound disinfectant, rations, lip balm, and perfumed soap sourced from Red Cross supplies. These were routine items to an American soldier, but to a Japanese woman officer who had been deprived of even basic hygiene products for months or years, they were unimaginable luxuries. Soap had become nearly impossible to obtain in late-war Japan. Domestic production had collapsed under the weight of bombings and shortages of fats and oils. Lip balm was virtually unknown among field units. Even nurses lacked it. Most had been caring for wounded soldiers with bare hands, chapped by heat, chemicals, and constant exposure. Now, suddenly, the enemy placed these small symbols of dignity into their palms. This encounter marked one of the most surprising humanitarian moments of the Pacific War, one that defied the expectations of both captor and captive. And to fully understand why this moment was so powerful, we must explore what came before it: the ideology, the conditioning, and the moral frameworks that shaped how Japanese women perceived American soldiers, and how American servicemen perceived their Japanese counterparts. Those deeper layers form the foundation of what followed next. And yet, even with the fires out, even with the danger gone, there was a weight in the air. The silence that didn't feel like victory, but like exhaustion. Because by now, the crew of USS Missouri understood something clearly. This wasn't about one ship. This wasn't about one kamikaze. This was about a nation willing to burn itself alive to avoid surrender. Moments after the impact, the deckhands stood near the twisted remains of the aircraft. The pilot's crushed body, the fragments of his uniform, the charred metal that used to be a machine of war. He was their enemy, but he was also a human being. And for a brief moment, even on board the most powerful battleship afloat, the crew felt something unusual: pity, respect, and a quiet realization that this war was reaching its darkest chapter. Missouri radioed the fleet. Minimal damage, no casualties. Continuing operations. But in the private thoughts of many sailors, the question lingered: how many more would come? How many more men, boys really, would crash their lives into steel because their leaders refused to face defeat? The denting Missouri's armor was minor, but the dent in the crew's minds wasn't, because they now understood what the next months would look like. And the truth was terrifying. The morning mist clung to the island slopes as Missouri steamed on. Smoke still curled from distant hills where Japanese fortifications had once loomed. Survivors of the kamikaze attacks moved like shadows, crouched in trenches and tunnels, their faces pale from hunger, fear, and the unrelenting sun. For the men on deck, it was almost surreal. Weeks of patrols, radar sweeps, and endless alerts had taught them to expect the worst. But now the enemy seemed both relentless and human. They had learned to measure threats in speed, weight, and trajectory. Yet nothing in their training had prepared them for the intimate terror of a pilot determined to die for his cause. Across the Pacific, the psychological strain was mirrored in Japanese command rooms. Officers debated strategy feverishly, balancing dwindling resources against fanatic orders from Tokyo. Each kamikaze sortie was both a tactical calculation and a desperate appeal to honor. Every loss was meticulously recorded, every success a fleeting solace. And through it all, the United States relied not just on steel and firepower, but on organization, resilience, and foresight. Ships were repaired quickly. Crews were rotated and rested. Airfields were maintained with obsessive efficiency. It was this combination, relentless pressure and meticulous support, that made the kamikaze attacks simultaneously terrifying and predictable. By mid-1945, American intelligence analysts had begun recognizing patterns. Flight timings, approach vectors, and even pilot behavior could be anticipated. Yet the horror of the human element, the willingness to die mid-air, remained an unquantifiable variable. And so Missouri pressed on, damaged but unbowed. The crew had faced death inches away, and yet continued their mission. For the Japanese pilots, the confrontation was deeply personal. For the Americans, it was professional, calculated, and terrifyingly routine. These early encounters would foreshadow the coming weeks of intense naval and air engagements, particularly around Okinawa, where the massed kamikaze waves would push both sides to the limits of endurance. The collision of human desperation and strategic execution was now inevitable. The story of one plane, one pilot, and one dent in Missouri's armor was over. But the broader narrative of sacrifice, ingenuity, and the human cost of war was only just beginning. For the Japanese pilots, each mission was a study in the extremes of human endurance. These were young men, often barely out of their teens, trained to fly aircraft with no expectation of returning. The kamikaze program was more than orders from high command. It was a psychological crucible. Pilots knew that taking off meant a one-way ticket. They spent their final hours writing letters, meditating on duty, and steeling themselves against the instinct for survival. On the American side, sailors on ships like Missouri faced a different type of human trial. Weeks of constant vigilance, the deafening roar of anti-aircraft fire, and the sudden terror of a plane plummeting toward the deck forged a tense rhythm of fear and discipline. Crew members learned to suppress panic and act with precision. Each minor dent in armor, each shock of impact, reminded them that survival was as much about training and coordination as luck. The collision of these human forces, pilots embracing death, sailors resisting it, created a unique tension. Observers later noted a complex mix of emotions: horror at witnessing intentional self-destruction, respect for the enemy's courage, and profound relief when their own systems held under assault. Even minor comforts, rest cycles, meals, and camaraderie became decisive in sustaining morale. The human element, it seemed, could not be measured merely in aircraft or bombs. It was raw, immediate, and hauntingly personal. The kamikaze threat was not just psychological. It forced the Americans to rethink naval tactics. Early in the campaign, attacks appeared random, but patterns emerged. Japanese pilots flew at dawn or dusk, favored specific attack vectors, and concentrated on high-value targets like carriers and battleships. American Naval Command responded with layered defenses. Radar-guided fighters patrolled perimeters. Anti-aircraft batteries were coordinated to create overlapping zones of fire. Damage control teams were trained to respond instantly. Even when a plane broke through the outer layers, rapid repairs and contingency planning ensured minimal operational disruption. Every strategic decision was informed by meticulous observation. The United States had learned that survival was as much about preparation as firepower. Each tactic, positioning ships, rotating crews, maintaining supply lines, was a direct counter to the human unpredictability of kamikaze pilots. The lesson was stark. Technology and strategy could only go so far. Success depended on anticipating human behavior under extreme conditions and ensuring every element of the ship and crew functioned as a single organism. Radar became a cornerstone of American defense against kamikaze attacks. Ships were equipped with early warning systems capable of detecting aircraft long before they appeared visually. This gave gunners precious seconds to target incoming planes and allowed crews to prepare damage control teams preemptively. Armor plating, once a static measure of defense, became part of a dynamic system. Ships like Missouri were not impervious, but the combination of thick belt armor, compartmentalized decks, and reinforced turrets allowed them to survive direct hits that might have destroyed older vessels. Even a dent in the side of the hull was meticulously logged, repaired and analyzed to inform future design improvements. Aircraft technology, too, played a role. American fighters patrolled strategic sectors, and bombers could interdict kamikaze bases. Innovations in communications ensured that every radar contact translated into immediate action. The interplay between human decision-making and mechanical reliability defined the technological advantage. For German and Japanese observers, this combination of speed, foresight, and redundancy was almost unbelievable. Machines worked seamlessly with humans, creating an almost invisible layer of protection and efficiency, a system the enemy could not hope to match under pressure. Leadership on both sides defined the outcomes of each encounter. American officers on ships like Missouri had to maintain composure amid chaos. Every decision, from fighter patrol coordination to damage control deployment, carried life or death consequences. Commanders relied on rigorous training, layered communication systems, and clear protocols to ensure that every sailor knew their role when kamikaze planes approached. Japanese officers, in contrast, were operating under collapsing hierarchies. Many units were fragmented. Orders arrived late or not at all, and the psychological pressure of impending defeat weighed heavily. Leadership was less about tactical advantage and more about enforcing morale and instilling the doctrine of sacrifice. These officers demanded unwavering obedience, often at the expense of common sense or individual survival. The juxtaposition was striking. American leadership was adaptive and responsive. Japanese leadership was rigid and ideologically absolute. In the field, this difference often determined whether a pilot survived, a crew held the line, or a ship remained operational after attack. Leadership was not merely strategic, it was the hinge upon which life and death swung. To Americans, kamikaze pilots represented a paradox. Enemies willing to die in service to a mission. Traditional warfare relied on force, position, and attrition. Yet here was a force that disregarded personal survival. Understanding this mindset became crucial. Intelligence officers analyzed flight patterns, backgrounds of pilots, and even training materials to predict behavior. Field commanders instructed crews not only to aim accurately, but to anticipate human desperation. Knowing the enemy meant recognizing that each plane was not just a target, but a mind set on collision. For the Japanese, American preparedness was equally incomprehensible. Rapid repairs, abundant resources, and the ability to absorb damage and continue operations confounded their calculations. Pilots expected to break ships, yet found vessels returned to battle almost immediately. The concept of resilience, so foreign to them, became a source of astonishment and fear. This mutual recognition of extremes, the human will to die versus the human will to survive, defined encounters across the Pacific, creating a tension that went beyond tactics or technology. War is measured not only in casualties, but in moral and psychological strain. On Missouri, sailors faced repeated exposure to imminent death, requiring them to suppress fear while maintaining precision. The moral calculus, shoot or wait, fight or endure, was constant. Each kamikaze strike forced decisions in seconds, with lasting psychological consequences. For Japanese pilots, morality was codified into doctrine: death for the emperor, honor above self. The moral imperative was absolute, leaving little room for personal survival. The burden of choice, however, still existed in the form of timing the attack, selecting a target, and confronting the inevitability of death. These extremes, American prudence versus Japanese fatalism, created a uniquely charged battlefield. Beyond the physical destruction, the war tested values, endurance, and human perception. The terror of imminent death, combined with the awe of human ingenuity and resilience, framed the Pacific conflict as not merely a clash of nations, but a confrontation of human will and morality. April 1st, 1945, Okinawa, Japan. The first light of dawn broke over the island, casting long shadows across jagged ridges and shattered villages. American forces had landed weeks earlier, but the Japanese resistance remained fierce. Among the most feared weapons of this campaign were the kamikaze planes, pilots willing to crash their aircraft into ships with lethal precision. On the deck of USS Missouri, sailors adjusted gun sights and radar operators scanned the horizon. Hours of anticipation had built tension into a near-palpable haze. The first contacts appeared as tiny specks far out at sea. Radar readings confirmed their speed, faster than most conventional fighters. Multiple planes were inbound, following calculated vectors designed to exploit gaps in the defensive screen. For the pilots, every moment of flight was both methodical and frantic. They had trained for months, studied trajectories, and memorized anti-aircraft patterns, but they had also embraced inevitability. The psychological weight of knowing survival was impossible pressed on them with every throttle adjustment. The Americans reacted with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Fighter squadrons intercepted several attackers. Gunners opened fire. and damage control teams stood ready to respond to any hit. Yet despite the layers of defense, one plane broke through. Banking sharply toward Missouri's port side, the metal shrieked through the air as shells struck its fuselage. Onlookers held their breath. The plane hit the armor belt at a shallow angle. There was no explosion, just the sound of twisted metal, and the pilot's final momentum carrying the aircraft into the hull. Crew members scrambled. Fires ignited near the deck, quickly suppressed by trained teams. The pilot was gone, the aircraft destroyed, and yet Missouri remained largely intact. Every dent, every damaged turret, every shockwave from impact was meticulously logged. Officers noted the effectiveness of armor placement, anti-aircraft response, and crew reaction times. But beyond the technical details, a profound realization rippled through the sailors. Human life was fragile, but preparation and discipline could temper the force of death itself. Meanwhile, Japanese command observed from makeshift bunkers inland. Plans had faltered. The combination of American radar, disciplined gunnery, and rapid repairs made even the most desperate kamikaze attacks increasingly difficult to execute successfully. Pilots who survived one sortie understood they would be sent again. Many did not survive. The battle continued throughout the day. Waves of aircraft attempted similar attacks, each intercepted or damaged, yet each reminding the Americans of the relentless human will behind the enemy. Smoke, fire, and the staccato rhythm of anti-aircraft fire created a surreal landscape. Chaotic, yet deeply structured by the principles of preparation, training, and tactical coordination. It was here, amid the chaos of the Pacific theater, that a fundamental truth became undeniable. The balance of power was no longer just a matter of weapons or numbers, but of psychology, resilience, and human ingenuity under extreme conditions. Even as the sun set, casting a red glow across the horizon, both sides understood that the war's outcome would hinge on endurance as much as strategy, on anticipation as much as courage, and on humanity as much as destruction. The day closed with Missouri still operational, her crew battle-worn but intact. The Japanese pilots' sacrifices had tested every skill and nerve of the Americans, but the defensive measures, training, and technology had held. Yet this was only the beginning. Okinawa's battles would intensify, producing waves of kamikaze attacks that would push both attackers and defenders to their absolute limits. The stage was set for the next crescendo, where timing, bravery, and tragedy would collide in ways that would leave lasting marks on both sides of the Pacific. By mid-April 1945, the skies above Okinawa had become a theater of unrelenting pressure. Kamikaze pilots flew in coordinated waves, often 10 or more at a time, seeking any breach in American air defenses. The morning haze was pierced by the silhouettes of approaching aircraft, their engines a sinister prelude to collision. On board USS Missouri and nearby vessels, sailors manned stations with unwavering precision. Radar operators tracked incoming contacts, fighter aircraft scrambled to intercept, and gunners braced for the inevitable. Each wave brought a mix of terror and tense anticipation. Even for veterans, the psychological strain was immense. The knowledge that any single miscalculation could be fatal hovered constantly in the air. At 09:43, a formation of 6 kamikaze planes approached from the northwest. Anti-aircraft fire shredded the first two, forcing them to crash into the sea. The third plane, banking sharply, clipped a smaller destroyer before careening into the superstructure of Missouri. Explosions rocked the deck. Fires ignited, shrapnel scattered, and alarms blared. Damage control teams leaped into action, extinguishing flames within minutes. The pilot, like countless others, had died instantly. Across the island, Japanese commanders watched the chaos with growing desperation. Their meticulous planning collided with a reality they could not control. American ships were fast, resilient, and unflinching. Every kamikaze that failed to hit a target reduced Japan's already limited pool of pilots. Morale began to fracture, and with each failed strike, the human cost escalated. Even when attacks succeeded in damaging vessels, the aftermath revealed another layer of American advantage: rapid repair and adaptability. Hull breaches were sealed, electrical systems rerouted, and critical armaments brought back online. What might have crippled a ship weeks earlier now took hours or even minutes to restore. For German and Japanese observers, this logistical efficiency was astonishing. It was more than engineering. It was a psychological weapon, a demonstration of the United States for capacity to absorb damage and continue the fight. By late afternoon, the pace of attacks intensified. Pilots, exhausted and facing near certain death, coordinated more aggressively. American radar screens became a blur of dots, signaling approaching threats from multiple angles. Anti-aircraft fire created a deafening symphony of explosions, smoke and tracer rounds streaking the sky. Every deckhand's reaction was choreographed, every defensive system operating at maximum efficiency. Amid this storm, human resilience stood out. Sailors dug into their roles with unwavering focus. Radar operators, gunners, and damage control teams acted as one unit, converting fear into disciplined action. Even as explosions rocked the deck and smoke filled the air, morale remained steadfast. Survival was a function of precision, anticipation, and sheer human determination. By evening, the toll of the day was staggering. Several Japanese pilots had perished. Multiple ships bore minor to moderate damage, yet no critical vessels were lost. The Americans had turned the kamikaze tactic from an instrument of terror into a measurable, controllable threat. This climactic phase revealed the stark contrast between opposing forces. Japanese pilots embodied absolute dedication, even unto death. American crews exemplified preparation, coordination, and technological integration. The clash was not just physical. It was a collision of philosophy, training, and human psychology. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the exhausted sailors of Missouri and nearby ships understood one unalterable fact: the battle was far from over. But the balance of human ingenuity, discipline, and resourcefulness had tipped decisively. This moment, where desperation met preparation, courage met discipline, and death met ingenuity, would echo through the final weeks of the Pacific War, setting the stage for the inevitable conclusion and the long, reflective aftermath of Okinawa's ferocious campaign. The smoke from the final kamikaze waves still lingered over Okinawa. Ships, though largely intact, bore the marks of relentless assault. Scorched decks, dented armor, and splintered gun mounts. On USS Missouri, crew members conducted detailed inspections. Each strike had left traces, scratches, burned paint, bent metal, but no critical failures. Damage control logs meticulously recorded every detail. From the minor dent along the starboard hull to the temporary loss of turret elevation. Casualties were surprisingly light, given the intensity of the attacks. Several sailors sustained minor injuries from shrapnel or shock, but fatalities were minimal. The combination of early warning systems, layered anti-aircraft defenses, and rapid emergency response had transformed potentially lethal strikes into survivable events. Yet the psychological toll was profound. Many sailors reported heightened anxiety, sleepless nights, and persistent vigilance long after the attacks ended. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces faced a starkly different reality. Hundreds of pilots had been lost, aircraft destroyed, and carefully executed plans frustrated. Strategic resources, planes, fuel, and trained personnel were diminishing at an alarming rate. Commanders faced the impossible task of sustaining offensive operations while managing the moral burden of sending young men into almost certain death. Reports from the front highlighted a critical imbalance. American naval efficiency and repair capabilities consistently neutralized the kamikaze threat. Ships returned to operational readiness within hours, maintaining pressure on Japanese positions. These rapid turnaround times were unprecedented. Where previously a single successful strike might have sidelined a vessel for days, the combination of trained crews, advanced repair equipment, and procedural discipline ensured continuity of operations. The broader strategic impact was undeniable. Okinawa remained a key staging point for further operations. And American dominance at sea was reinforced. Japanese attempts to slow the advance through kamikaze attacks were increasingly symbolic rather than decisive. Observers, both contemporary and historical, noted the growing inevitability. The combination of human resilience, technological superiority, and organizational efficiency would carry the Americans through the remainder of the Pacific campaign. Yet beneath the surface, subtle shifts occurred. The relentless pressure of kamikaze attacks forced both sailors and officers to confront human limits. Fear and fatigue were constant companions. Even in victory, there was recognition of the immense cost of war. In blood, in morale, and in the intangible weight of lives expended in the name of strategy. Missouri's crew, standing among dented steel and scorched paint, reflected on these truths. The battle had been survived, but survival had come through discipline, coordination, and preparation rather than brute luck. And as night fell over Okinawa, the silence was both triumphant and haunting. A reminder that the human dimension of warfare extended far beyond the damage inflicted or received. The Pacific had been tested by fire, and both sides had been reshaped by the ordeal. For the Americans, lessons in readiness and resilience were etched into memory and ship logs. For the Japanese, the tragic calculus of kamikaze sacrifice weighed heavier with each lost pilot and missed opportunity. The stage was now set for the continuation of the aftermath, where longer-term consequences, strategic shifts, psychological impact, and historical reflection would fully reveal the war's toll. In the weeks following the intense kamikaze assaults, the full scope of the battle's consequences began to emerge. Ships returned to ports for more thorough inspection and repairs. Hulls were reinforced, turrets recalibrated, and radar systems upgraded. Every dent and scorch mark from Okinawa became a lesson for future encounters, a blueprint for refining strategy and technology. The United States Navy had not only survived, but gained an operational advantage through experience. Casualty reports provided a sobering balance sheet. American losses remained moderate in comparison to Japanese sacrifice, but the psychological weight was significant. Sailors spoke of haunting images, planes diving from the sky, explosions shaking the decks, comrades narrowly escaping harm. Officers emphasized continuous drills and counseling, recognizing that the endurance of the human spirit was as critical as any weapon system. Japanese forces faced an even harsher reality. Kamikaze missions, while tactically impressive, exacted a devastating toll. Hundreds of pilots, many barely trained, had perished in what could only be described as a tragic human cost. Aircraft, fuel, and logistics resources were depleted at a pace that the Japanese command could not replenish. These losses compounded strategic pressure, eroding operational flexibility and accelerating the decline of Japan's defensive capacity. Historians later emphasized the significance of American rapid repair and adaptability. Ships struck by kamikaze attacks could return to combat within hours, not days, a remarkable logistical feat. The ability to absorb damage, restore functionality, and continue operations under relentless pressure became a hallmark of American naval strategy in the Pacific. This operational resilience magnified the psychological impact on Japanese planners, undermining morale and disrupting the perceived effectiveness of kamikaze tactics. Beyond immediate combat, the aftermath reshaped training, doctrine, and leadership. American naval officers reviewed every encounter for lessons in coordination, damage control, and anti-aircraft strategy. Every crew member, from gunners to radar operators, had contributed to a collective understanding of how to neutralize the threat of human-guided explosives. The battle had forged a hardened, more adaptive force, prepared for the final phases of the war. For the Japanese, the human toll extended beyond strategy. Families mourned young pilots who had been sacrificed for doctrine. Communities faced shortages as resources were diverted to sustain military efforts. Morale, already strained, fractured further under the weight of repeated kamikaze failures. The psychological calculus of sending men to die while enemy ships continued undamaged became a bitter acknowledgement of the gap between ideology and reality. Yet amidst this grim toll, some lessons of resilience and adaptability emerged. The Americans had not merely survived, they had turned a tactic designed to instill fear into a measure of operational superiority. Discipline, training, and technological innovation ensured that even the deadliest human-driven weapon could be mitigated. The interplay between human ingenuity and machine reliability had shifted the balance of war decisively. By the close of April 1945, the Pacific Campaign bore the unmistakable marks of its human and technological extremes. The clash of kamikaze pilots and disciplined American crews left scars in steel, mines, and strategy. It would not be forgotten. The battle had reshaped doctrine, influenced leadership thinking, and revealed truths about human resilience and the interplay of fear, preparation, and courage in war. As Okinawa settled into uneasy calm, the stage was ready for reflection, where the lessons of human sacrifice, technological adaptation, and moral endurance would be understood not only as military outcomes, but as enduring insights into the nature of warfare itself. Okinawa was more than a battle of ships and planes. It was a confrontation of human will, Sailors faced death with discipline. Pilots embraced it with resolve. Every dented hull, every scorched deck, every exhausted crew member carried a story of resilience and ingenuity. The kamikaze attacks revealed the extremes of human behavior in war. On one side, young Japanese pilots sacrificed themselves in adherence to duty and honor. On the other, American crews transformed fear into precision, using preparation, training, and technology to absorb and respond to relentless assault. Both sides demonstrated courage, but in profoundly different forms. Technological innovation amplified human potential. Radar, rapid repair capabilities, and coordinated defenses were not just tools. They were shields that allowed humans to survive what might otherwise have been inevitable destruction. The ability to repair a ship in hours, to anticipate attacks, and to maintain operational readiness under fire reflected a fusion of human intellect and mechanical reliability. Yet the war's lessons were not only technical, they were moral and psychological. War forced individuals to confront mortality repeatedly, demanding decisions in moments of intense pressure. The choices made under fire, whether to act, to endure, to protect, defined not just outcomes of battles, but the character of those who lived through them. In the end, Okinawa's legacy is a testament to resilience, adaptability, and the profound cost of conflict. It reminds us that warfare is not only measured in ships sunk or planes destroyed, but in the human spirit tested, sometimes broken, sometimes strengthened. The scars on steel mirror scars on the mind. The lessons of endurance extend beyond tactics into the realm of human understanding. As the smoke cleared and the Pacific skies quieted, the truth became clear. Victory depended as much on preparation, ingenuity, and discipline as it did on courage. And in that balance, the events of Okinawa left a lasting imprint on history, offering insights into the limits and the possibilities of human endurance under the most extreme circumstances.